Welcome back to Hope at Home. I'm excited to continue in week 6 of this teaching series, The Heart of a Conqueror. We've been dealing with developing our hearts in such a way that we are prepared to conquer any obstacle that the world throws at us. The enemy would try to defeat us with discouragement or with disease or with past sins or brokenness, that we would have like a well worked out, well tuned up, well readied heart to be victorious in whatever comes our way. And we've been looking at the story of Joshua as he has now taken leadership of the children of Israel. They've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they've crossed the Jordan River, and they're standing outside of the walled city of Jericho. And we see them outside this fortified city. Joshua's already been given a word from God that they're going to take the city. In fact, Christ shows up, the angel of the Lord shows up and says, hey, I'm here to lead the armies of God, and you're going to take the city, and all of it and everything inside of it's going to be yours. Jericho is a little bit scared because they see the army outside of all the Israelites. And then, God gives them sort of a very specific way of how they're going to do it. And as we delve into the story, we discover that there's a couple of different things that went down. We know that they ultimately take the city, but if you aren't familiar with the story, then, you see in, Joshua chapter 6, you see Jericho's completely shut up and no one's going in or out because they're preparing for battle. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 9, God says, "Hear, Israel, you're about to cross the Jordan and go into and dispose of nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky." And so this has already been, given to them as prophecy. This has already been given to them, in an earlier prophecy and then in a recent prophecy that they're going to go do this. They see that Jericho is nervous. That's why they're preparing for battle. And, if you look at the verse, it says, Jericho's shut up inside and out. Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. Jericho's shut up inside and out because of the people of Israel. No one went in, no one came out. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I've given Jericho into your hand, and with its king and its mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets and ram's horns before the ark, and on the 7th day you should march around the city 7 times, and all the priests should blow the trumpet. And when they make a long blast with a ram's horn, you will hear the sound of the trumpet. Then all the people will shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, and everyone will go straight before him." Now, think about that for a second. Think about God's plan in this moment to take the city. You hear the story of how they're going to go to the city, and for 6 days they're going to march in full, dressed armor, regalia. They're going to have, trumpeters, and they're going to have, the Ark of the Covenant, and they're going to walk around the city one time. And so for 6 days, they're going to walk around the city one time. And on the 7th day, they're going to walk around it 7 times. And then the 7th time around, they're going to play, the priests and the Levites are going to play the trumpet. And when the trumpet blast happens, then everyone is supposed to shout. And it's with that shout, that shout of obedience, that the walls are going to come tumbling down. And one of the things that I want us to take away from this passage is this idea that sometimes God calls you to do something, and this victorious shout, this worshipful shout, this obedient shout, in this case happens to be the tool by which that God brings them victory. And sure, it has very little to do with the shout itself and everything to do with the way in which they were obedient with the shout. But I want to take a look at, some of the nuances of this shout in and of itself. Like when we shout unto God with a voice of triumph, when we worship God with all of our hearts, when we live our lives out loud, there's this reality that comes along with it. Israel makes this long blast with the trumpets, accompanied by the resounding sound of their voices, and it fills the air. The shout wasn't a whisper, but it was a bold declaration of trust and gratitude towards God. It echoes with joy and excitement, its unwavering faith in the one who brought them this far. And so in verse 5, you see this, that when they make this long blast of the ram's horn, you'll hear the shout of the trumpet, and with it, all the people will shout with a great shout. And so there's a volume to this shout that's a powerful tool in the victory. The reason is because that's what God commanded. Now, I wonder, oftentimes in our lives, how many times do we live our lives with this great exuberance, this great volume, based off of what God has done and what God will do? Like in our prayer life and our worship life, and like what does that actually look like? If you fast forward chapter 6, verse 20, you see that they march around and then they do, 6 times, and they get to the 7th time, and it says the sound of the trumpet, and when the men gave a loud shout, this great shout, this loud shout, this shout of obedience is part of the powerful tool that God uses to bring the victory to them. When I was a kid, we used to sing a song, and the lyrics of the song was, "What a mighty God we serve! What a mighty God we serve!" Angels bow before him, heaven and earth adore him. What a mighty God we serve! And I just have this like fond memory of, we would sing this song, and when we would sing it, everybody would just say it from the top of their lungs, like, "What a mighty God we serve." And it wasn't like, "What a mighty God we serve." It's, "What a mighty God we serve." And I think sometimes in the unknown and in the scary and in the standing outside the walled city after marching around it for 6 days one time and thinking, well, this is stupid. This is, an exercise in not only futility but stupidity. Every day going home and going, nope, God hasn't done the miracle yet. Could you imagine what it was like to be them? And yet, at the end of it, they carried out God's commands with exuberance, with volume, with this great and loud shout. There's something about you following through with God's plans for your life, the vision that he has for you, with like sort of exuberance, with this sort of like powerful shout. There's something about that brings the victory in our everyday walking around, boring, eating, sleeping lives. The second thing I noticed about the shout was that the shout wasn't just a loud shout, but it was a celebratory shout. It wasn't merely an expression of faith, but also a celebration of what God had already done and what he was about to do. They praised God with this exuberance, with the singing and the clapping and the songs of joy and the shouting of triumph, and the shout proclaimed their belief in the victory. This imminent moment, because they knew the battle ultimately belongs to the Lord. Now, this idea of worshiping God with full volume, a lifestyle of full volume, isn't like solely something that you find in the story of Joshua. In fact, it's all throughout the Psalms. Psalm 47:1 says, "Clap your hands, all you people, shout unto God with loud songs of joy." Psalm 108 verse 9 says, "I shout in triumph." Psalm 81 verse 1 says, "Sing to the Lord your God for strength, shout for joy to the God of Jacob." And so this idea of you, and again, I think we could just collapse it into musical worship and say, well, if you don't worship, then God's not going to, if you don't sing the songs, then God's not going to give you the victory. Well, yeah, I suppose you could collapse it into that, but it's so much more than that, because your lifestyle of worship and the way that you go about your life and the way that you tell your story and your testimony with not only volume, meaning like all in all the time, but also with this celebratory attitude of, yeah, I know that God's going to do another victory in my life. And the reason that I know God's going to do another victory in my life is because I've already experienced one before. And so this time I believe he's going to do it again. And this sort of combination of these things, I think, is what prepares you for the victory. It prepares your heart, your mind, your soul to be ready to receive what God already has, because the victory is already the Lord's. Remember, in chapter 5, he says, look, I'm here and we're going to take the city. God speaks to Joshua this way, but yet they still have to go through the motions of obedience. And so you have this shout that's full volume. You have this shout that's fully celebratory. My curiosity makes me want to ask you this question. Like, where in your life are you living at a whisper when God's calling you to live at full volume? You get what I'm saying? Like, where is it that you need to turn up your faith? Where is it that you need to turn up your resolve? Where is it that you need to turn up your belief in that God goes before you and that he's already brought you the victory? And instead of whispering prayers in quiet, proclaiming them as if they've already happened. You know, God's given us this city, not gonna give, but given us. God's given us this healing. God's given us this victory. God's given us this success. We're gonna walk in that victory. We're gonna live from the place of victory. And then we're gonna celebrate. Like some people are like, oh, don't do the end zone dance too soon. But no, if God's already won and he goes and fights our battles before us, then why can't we live from a place of celebration? Why can't we live from a place of joy? I mean, honestly, if I'm just being point blank with you, I'm just so tired of seeing Christians who are sad all the time when God has given you victory. There's something to celebrate. That even though the victory isn't happened yet, he's already promised you the victory. So rejoice, be happy, choose joy, walk in the place of victory that he's already placed you in. Now the shout, though, comes before the victory. There's something about the shout that has to not only be this full volume, live your life all in, and this celebratory, like God has been there for us in the past, he'll be for us again, but also this shout that comes from a place of obedience. Contrary to conventional wisdom, the Israelites shouted before the walls fell down. They didn't shout after the walls fell. They shout before the walls fell. Why? Because God told them to. They acted in faith and trusted God's instructions. You know, obviously, it wasn't their shout that actually physically brought the walls down. I mean, somebody might try to tell you that. Somebody might try to tell you that there was enough of them that the resonance of their voice caused an earthquake-type rumbling and a seismic event happened. No, God tore the walls down. God told them in chapter 5 that he was going to do it and that they were going to win. But then God also told them to celebrate and out loud this victory even before the victory happens. And so they're demonstrating their unwavering belief in God's faithfulness, even though they've been, marching in a circle, for lack of a better phrase. Where in your life do you feel like you're just walking around in circles? Where in your life do you feel like, God, when are you going to actually bring me this victory? Where in your life do you feel like you're in this, needless boot loop, Groundhog's Day, over and over and over again, and you're trying to be faithful and you're trying to honor God? You look at it and it says, when, in verse 5, chapter 6, verse 5, it says, and when they made a long blast of the ram's horn, you'll hear the sound of the trumpet, and all the people will shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. And so the reality of the city wall falls down flat because God goes before them, but also because of their obedience. I mean, if you look at chapter 6, verse 20, they shouted and the priests blew the trumpets, and it all happened when the people heard the trumpet and they shouted with great shout. The walls fell flat and the people went into the city just as they said. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30 says it like this: by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. That there's something about you. Now think about this, right? Something about you living your life, a faith-filled life, a life of shout, right? A life where you say, I'm going to live my life out loud. I'm going to live my life from a place of victory out loud. And I'm not going to be apologetic for being celebratory of who God is and what he's doing in my life. And I'm going to live my life not only that's loud and celebratory, but I'm going to live it a life full of faith and obedience. And that's when the victory happens. I mean, we see it in the passage. We see it in so many other stories in our lives. When the conquerors shout, it teaches us this lesson. When Joshua and the children of Israel shout, it teaches us this lesson about our own lives. It reminds us that sometimes we have to raise our voices and praise God with all our might, even though it feels like we're facing difficult circumstances. Our shouts of faith and gratitude have the power to shift our perspective and invigorate our spirits and align us with God's purposes. There's something about a life where you practice full volume, celebratory obedience. Think about that for a second. Write that down somewhere. Full volume, celebratory obedience. I love that. I love the idea that they walk in this full volume celebratory obedience in what they're doing in the moment. And it's not that they didn't have doubts. It's not that they didn't believe it was going to happen. It's not that they weren't skeptical. They just knew that there's something about full volume celebratory obedience that brings the walls that are in front of you down to a rubble where you can walk right into the promised land and take advantage of it. My prayer for you today is that we together would be a generation of conquerors, that we would celebrate God's grace and his provision in our everyday lives, and that even when we face challenges, we would have the audacity, maybe even, to shout in triumph, knowing that the victory is already assured because of Jesus' work on the cross. My prayer is that you'd never forget that our shouts of faith can bring down the walls of doubt and fear and opposition that stand before us. And so as you go about your week this week, I want to leave you with this idea. Let's go forth with hearts and voices of praise, with shouts ready and unwavering faith to God. Let's fight our battles with this full volume celebratory obedience. And when we face walls in front of us, may our shouts of faith resound, knowing that the Lord is with us, and through him we are more than conquerors. I pray that you're blessed abundantly, above more than you could ask, think, or imagine, that you would go forth with this heart of a conqueror, ready to face every obstacle that could come in your way, and that by all means you would live your life in such a way where it's full volume, celebratory obedience that leads the way through any obstacle that stands in your way. In Jesus' name.